Scripture reading will be from Joshua chapter 24, verses 14 through 17. Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. If it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The people answered and said, Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For the Lord our God is he who brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage, and who did these great signs in our sight and preserved us through all the way in which we went and among all the peoples through whose midst we passed.
Last week we ended, as we walked through the Bible, we ended with the death of Moses there on Mount Nebo, and we mentioned that Moses has a very unique distinction. Aside from all that he did in his life, he was buried by God after having died there, having seen the promised land that he would not be allowed to enter into. That time, Joshua takes over the leading of the children of Israel, and they are right there at the Jordan River. They are sitting right across the river now from the promised land, and they are ready to go in. Joshua is a military man, and it's a perfect fit. It's a perfect fit that Joshua would succeed Moses and that he would be a military man. He was the one that led that battle against the Amalekites that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the one where Moses held up the staff. It was Joshua leading that army some 41 years earlier. And now he is about to lead the children of Israel into the land of Canaan, and he is going to be leading an army to conquer the land as God drives the people before them. But as any good military leader knows, he needs to know the lay of the land, right? So he sends those spies in to kind of see what is going on the other side of that Jordan River. Of course, the cities on the other side of the Jordan River, they can see the masses of the Israelites there on the other side, and they know they're coming, and they are already afraid. They're already knowing what is about to take place. Well, those spies go into the city of Jericho, the first city that they're going to come upon, and they run into a problem, right? And they have to be hidden. And one of the ancestors of our Lord himself, Rahab the harlot, is going to hide those men. And she is going to make certain that they get out of the city. And in return, they tell her what she must do that she might be saved at the time in which they do come and take the city. Well, the Israelites then prepare to cross over into the land of Canaan. The priests take the Ark of the Covenant and they walk down to the Jordan River, and when their feet hit the water, and it's not like sometimes I thought as a child with the Jordan River, this little narrow spot opened up, right, and they kind of all filed through it. 20 miles of the Jordan River dried up. God stopped the water 20 miles upstream, and the water stopped running. And they crossed over in the Jordan River Valley on dry ground there, and then made a monument. All this could be seen from the city of Jericho. I have stood on the ruins of the city of Jericho, and you can look off to the east, and you're going up the hill now. When you're at Jericho, you're well up the hill now as you're going up to the city of Jerusalem, which is some 4,000 feet higher. You're now looking down into the Jordan Valley, one of the lowest valleys on earth. And you can see the Jordan River going across there. So you can just imagine what it was like to stand on the walls of that city and see this mass of 2 to 3 million people coming across that river. Well, there's not a river there anymore. Coming across where the river was and coming towards your city. You can just imagine the fear. You can imagine that at night, when it was dark all around and you looked over toward the east, toward that same valley, all you saw was the lights of the camp of the nation of Israel. And those people had to be afraid, but yet they did trust that their walls could hold. You know, it's interesting that when you think about that the first city that they come to is a city that is known, at least from the standpoint of the way the Bible describes it, known for the wall that it had. It seemed to be a wall that most thought would keep them secure. And yet, that is exactly one of the fears that the spies had going back 40 years before, when the spies had entered the land, was that the cities were walled. And they had a great fear that they could not accomplish taking the land because of that. And here they are facing the first challenge in the Promised Land, and it is a walled city. And God is going to give it to them in a way that is impressive. So they walk around the city for 7 days. We know the story. And they yell and they blow the horns on that seventh day after they have went around it 7 times. And the walls fall. And they enter into the city and they kill every living thing, animal and human. The city is God's. The victory is God's. And every thing of spoil was to be placed into the treasury of the Lord. And yet we know the story, don't we? We know that that's not what happened. They went on to the next city, and it was a little city. It wasn't certainly a Jericho, and it was a little city of Ai, and they got beat, and they got beat bad. And the people began to ask why. So they began to cast lots, and they cast lots and brought it down to a tribe, brought it down to a family, got it all the way down to a single person. They kept casting lots until they got it down all the way to a man named Achan, who had taken a wedge of gold and a wedge of silver and a pretty robe. And that is why they lost the battle. Because he had disobeyed God. He had taken what belonged to God. And as a result, him, his family, and all of his possessions were stoned and burned. I think we need to take note that how God views violations of his commands. How we might look at that and say, well, that was so severe. And yet, instead of saying that was so severe, we need to understand the severity of sin in the face of a holy God. Sin had to be removed from the camp. They couldn't be God's people and that remain. And it's the same for the church. And we see that same idea given to blatant, disobedient people in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where Paul says that you've got to remove the leaven. A little leaven will leaven the whole lump. It's got to be removed. And they did that day. After that, they went and they destroyed Ai. I'm not going to cover all of the conquest. That would be more than we have time for tonight and what I'm trying to cover tonight. But I will tell you that, God said, I'm going to give you the land. I'm going to drive them from before you. It isn't like it's incumbent upon them to have this great military ability to conquer the land. God's on their side. On one particular day when they're fighting the Gibeonites, Joshua prays because the sun was going down and wants the sun to stand still, and it does, so that he can finish the battle. It's good to have God on your side, isn't it? In another battle, God sent down large hailstones on the army that they were pursuing, killing many of the men. It's good to have God on your side. God drove the Canaanites before them. God ensured every victory that the Israelites had as they conquered the land. Even in Joshua's old age, the land still had not been fully conquered. The people had become complacent. They had become comfortable. We can have this same problem in the church today. We can become complacent. We can become comfortable and forget that we're in a war and that God has called us to go out and fight for the victory. But they had their houses, they had their land, they could plant their crops. They've been wandering around for 40 years, it's time to sit down, right, and enjoy what we have. But they weren't done. They hadn't finished the work that was to be done. We see then that as Joshua is about to die, we see the text that was read just a few moments ago. He talks to them about the idols, the gods, the pagan gods of that land. He says, you need to choose who you're going to serve. Are you going to serve the gods of this land, or are you going to serve the God that brought you out of Egypt? You're going to serve the God that gives you victory. Choose you this day. Joshua made it very clear as to where him and his house would stand. And families, we should make certain that statement's true for us, that as for us in our house, we're going to serve the Lord. No matter what anybody else does, no matter what anybody else said. Those Israelites that day, they said, oh yes, far be it from us that we don't serve God. And yet while they said that, they wouldn't live up to it. They claimed a devotion to God but didn't live up to it. Not long after that, Joshua dies. And we enter into a time that that lines up with the book of Judges. We call it the years of the Judges. Judges begins with God condemning the Israelites for what we just talked about. He condemns them for not finishing the conquest that He told them to do. They did not destroy the Canaanite people as God had told them to do. They had made peace treaties. They had not bothered to attack some. And God says you want to keep them. We've already seen when they kept saying, you just brought us out here to kill us. God said, okay, that's exactly what I'll do. If that's what you want to keep saying. If you want to keep the Canaanite people, God said, I'll let you keep them. I will not now drive them out. I will not now push them out before you. They're going to stay. And He says they're going to be a thorn in your side. They're going to be the source of the Israelites' disobedience. They're going to be the source of the pagan influence that is going to time and time again plague the Israelite nation. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that evil communication corrupts good morals. You hang around with people like that, you're going to be influenced by them. And that's exactly what happened with the Israelites. They hung around with pagan people. They kept pagan people around them. And they became pagans themselves. I mentioned this morning how bad Solomon was as a king. And he started off so well. But there comes a point in Solomon's reign where we read in the Bible that he married strange women. Strange women being strange to God. Not that they were odd. But that they were strange to God. And it was the temples that he built for them. See, Solomon began to associate with people that were pagan. And it led him down that path that would divide the kingdom. Well, after God tells them He will no longer drive them out, the rest of the book of Judges is a cycle. It's a cycle by the people going round and round and round again. They turn from God. And as a result of their turning away from God, God oppresses them with one of those same foreign people that they decided not to drive out of the land. And they call to God for deliverance, and being the God that He is, He sends someone to deliver them. And they would be delivered. And after the deliverance, there's always this verse. It's usually just one verse. And it'll say something like, and they had 40 years of peace. And that's it. That's all you get of the good times. One verse. And then right back to it. The next verse is going to be right back into that they were doing things that were right in their own eyes. They were worshiping pagan gods. They're going away from God again. And the whole cycle begins again. And it just continuously does that throughout the book. The people straying from God was always because they decided to do what was right, as Judges says, in their own eyes. A person can always justify their desired wrong actions in their own eyes. Oh, I had a good reason. had a good reason for doing that. Well, we believe it, right? You ever had your kids give you the good reason for why they did what they did, and you think that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard? I remember telling mine a couple of times, if you can't come up with a good one, don't give me a bad one. I mean, just say I did it. I don't want to hear an excuse if it's that bad. They thought it was good. It sounded good in their brain. Looked good in their eyes. But it wasn't good at all, and that's certainly the case here in the book of Judges. The problem is that our justifications do not make wrong actions ever right, if they are those things that go against God. Well, there are 7 oppressions and 13 judges in the 300 years that encompass the book of Judges. Time frame includes the book of Ruth. That also takes place during the time of the Judges. And a portion of the book of Samuel. 1 Samuel, that is. Well, let's look at the judges that are in the book. We have first judge is Othniel. The second judge is Ehud. Ehud is the left-handed swordsman, right? That's kind of what he's known as. That he went to Eglon, the king of the Moabites. And Eglon was a rather large man, according to the Scriptures. And they searched him on his left side, where he would have drawn his sword with his right hand, but he was left-handed. So it was on his right side. He pulled it out and he stabbed Eglon and drove in, and says that the fat came down around the sword. He couldn't pull it back out. So he just left it. But he delivered the people with that action. We see Shamgar, the third judge. The Bible tells us that he killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. That's pretty impressive. Him and Samson are to get together with a jawbone and an ox goad, and they could really go to town, couldn't they? Because Samson's going to kill 1,000 Philistines with a jawbone of a donkey. We see Deborah, that woman judge, that kind of unique character in the Old Testament. But Deborah's not the only strong woman in that particular text. There's 2 strong women in the storyline of Deborah, right? You have Deborah, of course, that's leading that fight and leading the people at that particular time. But you also have after the battle. And the commander of the Canaanite army is running away, and his name is Sisera. And he comes to this tent, and there is a woman there named Jael. And Jael says, "Come on in here. I'll hide you." She says, "You lay down there on the floor and I'll put a rug over you. And nobody will see you," right? And then she took a tent peg and drove it through his head and into the ground. So there was another woman that was quite strong, quite willing to fight for her nation and for God. We know Gideon very well. Now, I don't think any military leaders ever went, "I've got too many men." I don't think any leaders ever said that. I think every military general, every military leader goes, "I could use a few more. I always want more men." There's 135,000 Midianites in the land. Gideon calls for the army of Israel. 32,000 show up. That's not good odds in and of itself, is it? 32,000 gets 135,000. That's pretty steep. God goes, "You've got too many men." Don't you know Gideon's going, "No, I don't." But he did, according to God. And so he asked the question, doesn't he? If you're afraid, you can go home. Well, 22,000 didn't have a problem with saying they were afraid. 22,000 walked away. So now he's got 10,000 men. Now you're 10,000 against 135,000, right? And God says, "You got too many men." Gideon had to say, "You got to be kidding me." And they went down to the river, right? And the drinking, whether you lapped or whether you brought the water up to your mouth, brings him all the way down to 300 men against 135,000. And yet, as they surround that army in the middle of the night and they break those pitchers and the torches are lit, that army begins to tear itself apart. And by the end of the day, God had delivered the people. We see Abimelech. You know, and not all the judges were great men of faith. Certainly Samson, while he ends well, didn't do very well at all in the middle. But Abimelech is another one of those that, while he was a judge, he really wasn't that good of a guy. And he tried to make himself king and was killed when a woman dropped a millstone on his head from a tower. And Abimelech, his last words that he said was, "Someone take a sword and kill me, so it's not said that I was killed by a woman." That's all he's worried about at the point of his death, is that he doesn't want it to be told that a woman killed him. He wants someone else to finish him off before that can happen. Then we have Tola and Jair. We know very little about them. We have Jephthah, another very flawed judge in many ways. And Jephthah may be best known for his foolish vow. He made a vow to God for victory, and the vow was that he would sacrifice the first thing that came out of his gate at his house. He won. And he went to his home, and the first thing out of the gate was his daughter. And Jephthah's not really the good of that story. It's the daughter that is. And her willingness to keep that vow to God. But Jephthah made a terrible, terrible vow. It is also Jephthah who fought the Ephraimites. You've heard the story about how you pronounce things, right? I'm a southerner, so there's some things I can't pronounce, and you put it before me, and I'm probably going to miss it every single time. But they took all the fords that went across the Jordan River, so the Ephraimites couldn't escape back across to the east side of the Jordan. And they had a test for them, right, to see if you were an Ephraimite. Apparently, they couldn't say Shibboleth. They would say Sibboleth. And so if you said Sibboleth, you were killed. There was a very similar thing in World War II. The Japanese, are certain letters that in our spoken language in English that they just cannot say. They don't say them in any portion of their language, so they can't say them. So all the passwords by the Marines and things of that nature would have those letters in them, because there's no way in this world the Japanese could say them right and try to fool the Marines. So that was the case with the Ephraimites as Jephthah fought them. Then we have Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. And then we come to the one that we know very well, and that's Samson. Samson, well, he's one of three people that are a Nazarite from birth. I know sometimes people say Jesus the Nazarite. Folks, don't ever say that. Jesus wasn't a Nazarite. He was a Nazarene because he was from Nazareth, but he was not a Nazarite. A Nazarite is a vow. We only have 3 recorded Nazarites from birth: Samuel, Samson, and we believe John the Baptist as well, based on things Jesus said. And all 3 of those were very interesting cases, because all 3 of those were born to women that were barren at one point, and the Lord gave them the ability to have children. Nazarite vow was a very strict vow. You couldn't cut your hair, so there's the reason why Samson's hair needed to stay long. Couldn't cut your hair. You could have nothing to do with wine whatsoever. In fact, you could not even touch a grape peel. It was so strict in that regard. And you were never to come into contact with something that was dead, not even a family member. You were to keep yourself ceremonially pure. Well, I can tell you Samson was about the worst Nazarite that probably there ever was. He ate honey out of a carcass of a lion, right? Dead lion. He killed 1,000 Philistines, as I told you, with the bone of a dead donkey, a jawbone of a dead donkey. He was constantly touching those things that were unclean. He didn't cut his hair. And God blessed him with great strength because of that hair. You know, also when I think about how deeply flawed Samson was in so many ways, there's parts of me when I read and I study about Samson that I just go, he wasn't very bright. He might have been fitting that mold, right, of the big strong guy. He's not too bright. Let me give you an example. your wife says, "What's the source of your strength?" And you lie to her. "Oh, if they put 7 ropes in this particular ropes on this particular way." And then all of a sudden, what do you know? You're bound just like you told her. And there's Philistines right there with her. And of course, that wasn't what took his strength, right? He just snapped them. She asked again, "What's the secret of your strength?" "Well, you got to tie me with ropes that have been dried." No, he's got all these, things about ropes. And they tie him up again, and you wake up again. The Philistines are upon you, and he's tied up just like he said. And you snap the ropes and you defeat the Philistines. Is anybody getting a clue at this point as to what's going on? How do you have your, what would cause your strength to go away? Well, if you take my 7 braids and you put them you made them into like a web and pinned them. And all of a sudden you wake up and your hair is done like that. And the Philistines are upon you. That's 3 times in a row. You've got to start figuring that out. Like I said, he wasn't bright. How do you have your strength? Well, if you cut my hair, it would be gone. Next time he wakes up, he's bald. And before long after that, he's got his eyes gouged out. And he's pushing a mill press. And then he's in the middle of the Philistine theater or Colosseum type place. And he finally understands. And he looks to God. And God gives him one more time of the strength that he gave up so foolishly. And it's the last thing he does. The last one, and we simply put him in there because he is the kind of the bridge between the judges and the kings, because he will anoint both David and Saul, is Samuel. Samuel grew up being raised in the tabernacle by Eli. And as bad a parent as Eli was to his sons, let me tell you what, his sons were sorry. And they caused the Ark of the Covenant to be taken by the Philistines. They are killed in the process. Eli dies upon hearing the news because he falls off of his bench and breaks his neck. As bad as he was, he did a good job with Samuel. Samuel was a strong prophet and judge of God's people. And he would continue to be that till the time in which he died during the reign of Saul and just before David, even though he had already anointed him. When we look at these people, we look at these events in the Israelite nation, in Judges, there's one thing that comes across to me. God so desperately wants to deliver us from ourselves. How many times would you want to keep delivering these people just to watch them turn around and turn against you again, and yet here you come again to deliver them again and again and again and again? God wants to deliver us from our bad choices. He wants to deliver us from those things that would destroy us. You know what He's like? He's like a loving Father who constantly longs for the best for His children, even when His children aren't the best that they can be. This evening, I hope and pray that you're living your life as you should, that you're not living your life according to what is right in your own eyes, because that's just a recipe for failure, but that you're living your life in a manner that is right in God's eyes. And if you've got your life in a mess, all you need to know is that God so desperately wants to deliver you from it, if only you will. If we can help you with that, we hope and pray that you will let us as we stand.
Let us reach out and give.